What if the object your child cherishes the most is quietly shaping the darkest part of their mind? In the world of criminal psychology, we often look for obvious red flags, violent outbursts, chilling drawings, disturbing confessions. But what if the earliest sign was a toy, one that seemed harmless, even cute, a symbol of comfort that, over time, became a tool for rehearsing horror? In today's case, we're not just telling a story. We're unraveling a psychological puzzle. A boy, no older than 10, adored a specific toy. It was always in his hand, in every photo, every video, every room he entered. But this wasn't just attachment, it was fixation. And what makes this story deeply disturbing isn't the toy itself, but what it came to represent. From the outside, everything seemed normal. He smiled, he played, he said please and thank you. But underneath that polite mask was a cognitive pattern that forensic psychologists would later classify as emotionally detached, with early signs of conduct disorder. These are not labels thrown lightly. They are clinical indicators that, when traced back to childhood, often align with violent outcomes in adolescence. The toy in question wasn't inherently violent. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't grotesque. But in the hands of this child, it transformed. It became the centerpiece of his inner world, a repetitive instrument in imaginary scenarios that no adult seemed to question, until it was too late. This isn't a tale about a cursed object or some twisted game. This is about behavioral development, about how neglected emotional trauma can silently morph into dangerous coping mechanisms, about how the things children play with and how they play with them can reveal more than we dare to admit. This is where criminal behavior starts, not with blood, but with symbolism. In the field of criminal profiling, there's growing attention on the subtle intersections between childhood play and deviant cognition. Repetitive play with specific roles, objects, or outcomes isn't always innocent. Sometimes it's a rehearsal, a psychological prelude. And in this case, the toy wasn't just part of his childhood. It was part of his formation as a future offender. So why didn't anyone see it? Why did the warning signs pass as quirks, as phases, as creativity? That's the question that haunts every psychological report on this boy. It's the same question that might make you look twice at a child's playroom, at the stories behind their games, at the things they don't say out loud but act out again and again in silence. This is not just a story, it's a mirror, a chance to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the earliest signs of future violence aren't loud, they're quiet, consistent, and tragically dismissed. If stories like this one shake you, make you reflect, and force you to question what you thought you understood about childhood and criminal behavior, then you're exactly the kind of person this channel was created for. Subscribe now so you don't miss the cases most people are too afraid to discuss. And tell me in the comments, have you ever noticed something in a child's behavior that felt off, but you couldn't quite explain why? Because what comes next in this story is where the innocent mask slips, and the truth underneath will change how you see childhood forever. He was 8 years old when people around him began to sense that something was off. Not because he caused trouble, not because he acted out in public, but because he didn't react to the world the way other children did. He was quiet, painfully quiet. In a room full of noise, he would sit motionless, eyes fixated on his toy, seemingly unaware of the chaos around him. But those who paid attention saw that he was not unaware. He was watching, closely, noticing things that most kids didn't, the way people moved, the tone in their voices, the timing of every small gesture. It wasn't just observation, it was analysis, and it came from a mind far older than his age suggested. His parents described him as a calm, curious child. He didn't cry easily, didn't laugh out loud, didn't seek hugs or attention. He didn't have friends, but he didn't seem to mind. There was an eerie self-sufficiency in him, a detachment that psychologists later called early indicators of emotional flattening. He didn't respond to praise or punishment the way other kids did. He wasn't interested in pleasing authority figures or testing limits. He simply followed the rules when convenient, broke them without guilt when they weren't. This lack of emotional feedback is one of the earliest behavioral markers studied in developmental criminology. Family life was quiet, not abusive, not chaotic, but distant. His mother struggled with untreated depression, often locked in her room. His father worked double shifts and spoke little during the hours he was home. The house was clean, but cold, structured, but emotionally barren. In that emotional vacuum, the boy found solace in routine and in objects he could control, specifically his toy, a stuffed animal with button eyes and a stitched smile, worn at the edges from constant handling. It was the one thing he kept close every day, clutched tightly in his hands, even while eating, walking, or falling asleep. What concerned some teachers and neighbors wasn't just his attachment to the toy, but how he used it. He wasn't just playing, he was creating scenarios, elaborate, repetitive ones, where the toy was placed in situations of danger, injury, and rescue. But the rescues always came too late. The toy always ended up hurt, and the boy would sit silently afterward, staring at it as if studying the aftermath. These weren't ordinary make-believe games. These were rehearsals of failure, trauma, and detachment, disturbingly consistent themes in criminal psychological development. There were also early signs of disrupted empathy. A classmate fell on the playground, blood dripping from a scraped knee. The boy looked, not with concern, not with fear, but with a strange, steady interest. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. Later he asked questions, not about the pain or how to help, but about how much blood there was, how long it took the bleeding to stop. These moments passed without intervention. Most adults chalked it up to childhood curiosity, but forensic psychology teaches us that these moments are often the first data points in a dangerous progression. In his drawings, the toy was always central. But more troubling were the surrounding details: fire, cages, broken windows, and large, dark figures with no faces. His art was dismissed as imaginative or eccentric, but those with training in criminal behavior analysis would have read them as clear indicators of internalized distress and a fixation on harm and control. He never drew people. Only objects, rooms, shadows, and always the toy, sometimes damaged, sometimes torn, and often surrounded by what looked like weapons made of everyday items. At home, his behavior continued to evolve. He began isolating himself more, requesting that his meals be left outside his door. He said the toy didn't like noise. He said the toy didn't trust people. One night, his father found him whispering to it, gently rocking it in his arms. When asked what he was doing, the boy responded very calmly that he was teaching it not to scream. That sentence, said so matter-of-factly, never left his father's mind. Sleep patterns also became irregular. He stayed awake longer each night, often pacing. One morning, his mother found dozens of small paper notes scattered on the floor. Each one had short, cryptic phrases. "It listens. Don't blink. He deserved it. Make it stop." None of the handwriting was legible enough to confirm it was his, but no one else had access to his room. Psychologists agree that the foundation of many violent behavioral disorders begins during the formative years, shaped by a blend of genetic, predispositions, and environmental stimuli. In this boy's case, emotional neglect, cognitive isolation, and the symbolic power he gave to the toy created a fragile but dangerous psychological construct. What he lacked in physical aggression, he made up for in cognitive rehearsal, a process where the mind repeatedly envisions actions, making them more accessible and acceptable over time. He didn't hurt animals. He didn't threaten other kids. There were no acts of violence, yet. That's what made his case so difficult to recognize early. Because he didn't express rage, he expressed curiosity, cold, clinical curiosity. And the toy became his language, his tool, his companion in a world that felt too distant, too unsafe, too uninterested in who he was becoming. No one connected the dots. The teachers didn't see a threat. The parents saw a quiet, independent child. The system had no alarms for kids like him. Kids who smile politely, obey the rules, and yet harbor inner worlds that are rehearsing something else entirely, something far darker. As the months passed, the boy's rituals intensified. He began hiding the toy in unusual places, beneath floorboards, inside kitchen drawers, behind the bathroom mirror. When asked why, he gave inconsistent answers. Sometimes he said the toy was hiding from someone. Other times that it needed to watch people without being seen. One afternoon, he told his teacher that the toy would soon show him how to protect himself. and that no one would understand. Unless they saw what he saw. These moments should have triggered concern. They should have prompted evaluation, but they didn't. Because he didn't scream for help. He didn't act out in public. He wasn't violent. He was invisible in his pain, and that invisibility was mistaken for resilience. The early behavior of this child mirrors patterns observed in case studies across forensic psychology. Intense object attachment, emotional detachment, silent rehearsal of harm, fascination with injury, and symbolic displacement of control through inanimate objects. Each isolated, these might be dismissed, but together they form a chilling portrait, not of a monster, but of a child quietly stepping toward the edge, holding tightly to the one thing that gave him power in a world that never gave him comfort. And still, the toy was there, always, watching with stitched eyes, listening with no ears, waiting for the next chapter to begin. At first, the toy was simply present, a constant yes, but passive. It followed him from room to room, sat with him at meals, and laid beside him at night. But over time, something changed. The toy stopped being an accessory to his world, and instead became the core of it. His interactions with it deepened, sharpened, and shifted into patterns that suggested far more than play. What started as an emotional crutch soon evolved into a structured behavior loop, a ritual. And in the world of developmental psychopathology, when behavior becomes ritualized in childhood, it's often the first signal that fantasy has begun to solidify into psychological reality. He didn't just play with the toy anymore. He prepared for it. Every morning, the boy would wake up and begin the day by whispering to the toy, holding it tightly, and staring at it for several minutes without blinking. These sessions grew longer. He developed rules about where the toy could go, who could touch it, and how it should be treated. Anyone who violated these unspoken rules was met with sudden, sharp resistance. One classmate once picked it up off the floor, only to have the boy scream and yank it away, muttering under his breath that now it was contaminated. Not broken, contaminated. A word he used with frightening precision. He began to isolate both himself and the toy. They needed privacy, he claimed. They couldn't be seen together in certain rooms. He said things like the light was too loud or the floor was watching. These weren't the imaginative ramblings of a creative child. They were calculated responses to perceived threats in his cognitive environment. Psychologists define this kind of behavior as indicative of early dissociative patterns. He wasn't pretending. He was constructing a separate framework of reality and defending it with consistency and logic that disturbed even trained observers. The toy itself started to change too. He modified it subtly at first. A new patch here, a string added there. But soon, the changes became more deliberate. He darkened its eyes with ink, removed its smile, and stitched a thin red line in its place. He cut its limbs and reattached them in odd angles. Each alteration was done in secrecy, and when questioned, he would say the toy asked for it. He wasn't harming the toy in anger. He was transforming it. Ritual transformation, especially involving objects of attachment, is a significant marker in the study of childhood psychopathy. It reflects internal struggle externalized through symbolic action. Every interaction became ceremonial. He created specific times of day when the toy had to be placed in certain positions, facing doors, hidden under furniture, or suspended from shelves by string. He claimed these positions kept the toy safe, or sometimes that they kept everyone else safe from the toy. The lines blurred. He no longer differentiated between controlling the toy and being controlled by it. This kind of behavioral enmeshment, where the self becomes indistinct from an object, has been observed in case studies involving early-onset conduct disorder and schizotypal traits. At school, his games during recess stopped involving other children. He would sit alone in the farthest corner of the yard, drawing large shapes in the dirt with a stick, while the toy sat propped beside him. The shapes often mirrored symbols later identified by forensic analysts as resembling restraints, traps, and containment structures. No one else noticed. To most, it looked like a child playing quietly with his stuffed friend. But what he was doing was rehearsing, repeating the same patterns, drawing the same symbols, over and over. Repetition is often a key component in the ritualization of deviant cognitive processes, reinforcing internal narratives that become harder to interrupt over time. The boy began keeping a notebook. In it, he wrote only about the toy, but not in a childlike way. The entries read like reports, observations, commands, memories that weren't always his, lines blurred. Again, he began referring to the toy in the third person in some entries, and in the first person in others. One page read simply, "We were not ready, but now we know." Another had a list of names, none of which matched any classmates, family members, or known acquaintances. Alongside each name was a scribbled shape and the word test. To an untrained eye, it was nonsense. To a criminal behavior analyst, it was a chilling sign of dissociative role projection and possible early delusional ideation. He also began creating boundaries for the toy, taping off sections of his room, placing objects in patterns around it before sleeping. He called it the circle. Breaking it, he said, would lead to consequences. One night, when the family cat wandered into his room and stepped inside the taped border, he flew into a panic. He screamed, cried, and then became completely silent for the rest of the evening. The next morning, the cat was missing. He claimed it ran away, but his behavior changed after that. He became calmer, more focused, and more protective of the ritual. In criminal psychology, sudden behavioral shifts after a traumatic or violent event often indicate a threshold being crossed internally. Something that was once imagined has now been acted upon, and the mind adapts quickly to that new reality. As weeks passed, he stopped sleeping with the toy. Instead, it was given its own space, a box, decorated and locked. Inside were small trinkets, bits of string, pieces of paper, and oddly shreds of fabric that didn't match anything from his clothing. He called it the chamber. He said the toy needed time to think, and only he could open it. When someone else tried, he reacted with rage, followed by complete dissociation. For hours afterward, he wouldn't speak or respond to his name. He'd just sit by the box, unmoving. This kind of behavior, consistent and escalated, aligns with what researchers refer to as symbolic displacement in early-stage psychopathological profiles. He also began staging scenarios, using household objects to recreate scenes. The toy always played the same role: bound, threatened, punished, or silenced. Sometimes the boy would narrate these scenes in a flat, mechanical voice. Other times, he would speak as if someone else were directing him. In one particularly disturbing episode observed by a babysitter, he reenacted a mock trial where the toy was accused of betrayal. He listed its crimes, gave a verdict, and then struck it repeatedly with a "hey" spoon. Then calmly, he placed the toy back in the chamber and closed all of it. Every routine, every setup, every whispered conversation wasn't just play. It was ritual. The toy had become more than it was now a symbol of control, of memory, of something broken inside that had found a voice through stitches and stuffing. In criminal behavioral science, this level of symbolic internalization is often seen in profiles of individuals who later develop complex violent ideologies. The object is no longer external. It becomes an extension of thought, emotion, and eventually action. But to the outside world, nothing looked alarming enough to warrant intervention. He was quiet. He didn't disrupt class. He didn't start fights. He didn't run away. His grades were average. His parents, while distant, weren't negligent in the traditional sense. And so, the rituals continued, grew, hardened. He was no longer a boy with a toy. He was a boy with a pattern, one that one could see forming in plain sight, one that would soon become irreversible. Because while most children outgrow their favorite toys, he didn't. He evolved with his, or maybe, more accurately, into it. Before you continue with this content that reveals the hidden side of human behavior, you need to check out the ebook Manipulation. Inside, you'll uncover the mechanisms behind mind control, behavioral influence, and the silent strategies used by people who manipulate their environment without being noticed. It's a true map of the mind. You'll learn how real psychological control techniques work, and how some individuals camouflage, strike, and influence others while staying invisible. You need to take this knowledge to the next level, because in the psychological game, those who don't understand become pawns. After the video ends, open the link in the description and get the ebook. The rituals had become so ingrained, so meticulously constructed, that even his daily speech began to follow a pattern. He spoke in loops, often repeating certain phrases under his breath, phrases that seemed to belong to someone else, echoes of voices he had heard but never fully processed. His mother once heard him whispering late at night through the door, not to the toy this time, but seemingly to himself. But the words weren't those of a child. They were fragments, commands, warnings, and woven into those murmurs were pieces of his past, memories not directly spoken but replicated, in tone, in rhythm, in fear. What few knew, what even his family had buried beneath layers of denial, was that his earliest years were steeped in a silence much heavier than the one he carried in the present. A silence filled with tension, unpredictability, and the cold absence of nurturing connection. Before he turned 4, his home was not the structured, quiet place it later became. It was chaotic. His father, then unemployed and drinking heavily, oscillated between emotional detachment and sudden bursts of verbal aggression. His mother, overwhelmed by postpartum depression, withdrew entirely, often leaving the boy alone for hours with only a static television and an untouched plate of food. These early conditions, defined by emotional neglect and sporadic exposure to hostility, laid the groundwork for a behavioral architecture that would later mirror detachment, mistrust, and internalized rage. He learned not to cry, not because he was strong, but because cries were met with silence or reprimand. This early conditioning teaches children a devastating lesson: that emotional expression is dangerous, unproductive, or invisible. In forensic developmental psychology, such early responses to trauma often evolve into emotional numbness, the inability to regulate or even access one's own feelings, a common precursor to antisocial behavioral patterns. For him, the toy became a safe vessel, the only consistent witness to his experience. It never ignored him, never yelled, never walked away. It absorbed everything. The home eventually stabilized, at least on the surface. The father got a job. The mother started medication. But by then, the damage had calcified. The boy had already constructed his own internal world, one that made sense only to him, governed by rules that protected him from further emotional injury. And the toy, so tightly woven into that world, became both a mirror and a shield. It was the one object he could project onto without fear, and he projected everything. In his interactions, subtle patterns began to emerge, replications of behaviors he had witnessed during his formative years but never understood. When playing alone, he would mimic yelling, arguments, slamming doors, even mimicking deep, angry tones that weren't his own. He wasn't just imagining conflict, he was replaying it. This reenactment behavior is widely documented in the study of childhood trauma. Children absorb their environment through their senses, and without context or comfort, these memories become scripts they unconsciously perform later in life. Even in social situations, his responses hinted at buried scripts. When another child accidentally bumped into him at school, he froze, then immediately took 3 steps back, holding the toy between them like a barrier. No words, no anger, just immediate withdrawal and repositioning, protective, defensive, rehearsed. He had learned, in those early unstable years, that physical proximity could shift rapidly from neutral to dangerous, and that staying silent and still was safer than reacting. These conditioned survival responses often carry over into adolescence and adulthood in individuals later diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder or dissociative behavioral patterns. His nightmares intensified, but he never called for his parents. Instead, he would wake up, turn on his small lamp, take the toy from its chamber, and sit facing the wall for hours. He'd murmur things like, "It's okay now," or "I stopped the noise." Once, his mother found the phrase "he won't hear it again" written over and over in pencil on a piece of cardboard under his bed, each line pressed deeper than the last. This obsessive repetition, especially when tied to auditory triggers or traumatic memory, has been observed in several case studies involving trauma-induced dissociation in minors. These aren't simply habits. They're coping mechanisms forged in moments of fear and helplessness. He had once heard his father refer to the house as a war zone, back when the tension between him and his mother reached its peak. The boy never forgot that phrase, war zone. He began referring to his room that way in his drawings. One drawing, later analyzed by a forensic psychologist, depicted a bed surrounded by barbed wire, with the toy in the center and stick figures outside, faces crossed out, mouths erased. Another showed the toy alone on a cliff, with the words, "No more sounds" written below in a careful, repetitive hand. These images weren't just expressions of imagination. They were emotional records, diaries of a mind processing pain it didn't have words for. When a neighbor began visiting the house regularly, a man the boy didn't recognize, his rituals intensified. He insisted the toy not be touched, not even looked at. He created rules for when it could be taken out and when it had to stay hidden. He began locking it away during certain hours and only speaking to it through a vent in the floor. The neighbor, later revealed to be his mother's therapist, never interacted directly with the boy, but his mere presence altered the psychological balance in the house. The boy sensed something unfamiliar, a disruption of the fragile system he had created. In forensic child psychology, external stimuli that threaten established coping mechanisms often trigger regressions or behavioral escalation, and that's precisely what happened. During these weeks, he became more controlling of his environment. He rearranged furniture in his room, covered vents, unplugged lights, and placed notes on the door with warnings. One read "No noise" or "He comes back." Another simply said, "This is not yours." He began spending more time under his bed, in closets, and inside makeshift hiding spots. Not to escape, but to listen, to record. The toy, again, was present for every moment, placed at the perimeter of these spaces like a sentry. Observers might have dismissed this as imaginative fort building, but in psychological terms, he was recreating safe zones, rooted in early memories of hiding during parental fights, of being forgotten in dark corners where silence meant survival. There was no record of physical abuse, but emotional neglect can carve deeper wounds, ones invisible to the untrained eye. When a child grows up without attunement, without being mirrored, held, acknowledged, their sense of self distorts. They begin to believe that they must control their world to be safe. And in that control, they often turn to symbolic anchors, objects, rituals, patterns that bring predictability to a life that once felt chaotic. For this boy, the toy wasn't just an object of comfort. It was the blueprint of his emotional survival system, a totem that bore the weight of everything unspoken, everything unfelt, everything feared. As the house grew quieter, as his parents' conflicts disappeared behind closed doors and polite dinners, his internal world only grew louder. Trauma doesn't vanish. With time, it adapts. And for children like him, children who experience high-functioning environments built on repressed chaos, that adaptation often takes the form of hyper-control, emotional suppression, and cognitive displacement. These are the traits that build the profile of what criminologists define as latent dissociative behavior, a quiet, detached observation of life that eventually fractures under pressure. He still smiled in photos, still showed up to school, still answered questions when asked. But behind his eyes, the narrative had already changed. The toy had become more than ritual, more than symbol. It had become the container for every experience he couldn't explain, every fear he couldn't name, and every violent echo from a childhood that left more marks than anyone dared to admit. It began like any other afternoon. The house was silent. The boy in his room, the toy positioned in the corner near the window, just as it always had been. His mother was in the kitchen, going through the habitual motions of preparing dinner. His father, delayed at work, wouldn't arrive until long after dark. And outside, the neighborhood existed in its usual rhythm, unaware of what was about to unfold behind that closed door. What made this day different wasn't immediately visible. There were no screams, no shattering glass, no loud footsteps. The transformation happened in near silence, inside the invisible space where imagination dissolves and action begins. He had been, withdrawn for days leading up to it, more withdrawn than usual. His rituals became increasingly rigid, almost frantic in their execution. The toy was moved not only with precision, but with a sense of urgency. The positions changed rapidly. Under the bed, in the closet, next to the door, inside the chamber, out again, then upside down. The boy began writing more often, the notes piling up, each one shorter, more frantic. His handwriting lost its former neatness. Now the letters were slanted, pressure-heavy, often cutting through the paper. Phrases repeated like mantras, not safe, not safe, not safe. He walks now. Do it before it's late. Hear him, hear him, hear him. On that day, the toy sat alone for longer than usual. He didn't speak to it, didn't look at it. Instead, he sat on the floor, his back against the wall, eyes open but unfocused, hands wrapped around his knees. When his mother called him for lunch, there was no answer. She assumed he was napping and let him be. She didn't. No, he hadn't blinked in 23 minutes. The camera footage later retrieved from the baby monitor in his room, which he had hidden intentionally to observe himself, showed no movement during that time, just stillness, pure, unnerving stillness. And then he moved. He rose slowly, walked to his desk, opened the drawer, and took out an object he had created from household items: metal from a broken hanger, tape from a roll he had hidden, part of a plastic knife from a toy kitchen set. It was, small, crude, but sharp enough. His face showed no fear, no hesitation. In forensic behavioral profiling, this flat effect, this emotional neutrality during premeditated violence, is one of the most consistent traits found in early-stage psychopathic presentations. It doesn't reflect evil, it reflects disconnection, a severed tie between empathy and action. He stood over the toy for several seconds. Then, with deliberate force, he stabbed it. Not once, not in anger, but multiple times in exactly the same pattern. Neck, chest, stomach, legs. He didn't speak during this moment. Only his breath quickened. And after the 8th strike, he sat back, holding the object in his lap like a surgeon inspecting a procedure. He then began to bandage the toy using tissue, tape, and gauze from the medicine cabinet. And that's when the shift occurred. He wasn't simulating anymore. He was documenting, practicing, and what he did next made that painfully clear. He retrieved a small notebook and, wrote, "It didn't scream. He said it would. Now I know." Those 3 sentences were circled repeatedly, the ink bleeding through to the next page. The analysis of that notebook would later indicate that these statements weren't just thoughts. They were confirmations, evidence of an internal dialogue being carried out for weeks, perhaps months, leading to this exact moment. A moment that, according to experts in juvenile behavioral forensics, represented a clear crossing of the threshold between imaginative rehearsal and intentional harm. His younger cousin arrived shortly after, a boy of 5, innocent, unaware, running down the hall with a toy car clutched in his hand, looking for someone to play with. He opened the door to the room. The older boy didn't move at first, just looked up, calm, inviting. He asked the cousin to come in, to help, to play a game. The cousin sat down eagerly, unaware of the rules. The game, the boy said, was about quiet. Who could stay still the longest? He placed the toy in the middle of the room, drew a circle around it with chalk, asked his cousin to sit inside it. Then he left the room, closing the door gently behind him. He waited outside for exactly 4 minutes, then re-entered. His cousin was sitting cross-legged, smiling, waiting for the next instruction. That's when the older boy reached into his pocket and took out the same makeshift weapon he had used earlier. But this time, he didn't approach with calm curiosity. His breathing changed, rapid. His hands shook, but not with fear, with intensity. And still, he said nothing. What happened next lasted less than 30 seconds. His movements were precise, calculated. The first injury was superficial, a scratch, but it was enough to make the cousin cry out. The sound shattered the boy's concentration. He stopped, dropped the object, stared at his cousin, now screaming, trying to crawl out of the circle. He didn't help him, didn't comfort him. He simply walked to the closet, took the toy, and placed it back into the chamber. Then he stood still until his mother ran into the room. The image she saw froze her in place. Blood, the crying child. Her son standing, silent, eyes vacant, hands stained. She screamed his name. He didn't answer. She asked what happened. Still, no response. She reached for the injured child, and the older boy finally spoke. Quiet, monotone. He said, "The toy told me to test it." He screamed too soon. It wasn't supposed to scream yet. At the hospital, cousin was treated for minor injuries. Physically, he was fine. Psychologically, the trauma would take years to untangle. The boy was taken for psychiatric evaluation immediately. No resistance, no reaction. He simply followed the officers, clutching the toy in his hand. It was the first time anyone realized how deep the delusion had rooted. During interviews, he referred to the toy as a separate entity, sometimes as a friend, sometimes as a guide, and sometimes as a judge. When forensic psychologists began their assessment, they found a complex mix of symptoms: emotional detachment, blunted affect, repetitive ideation around harm and punishment, an absence of remorse paired with a highly structured internal moral system, but one that was entirely his own. He didn't perceive what he had done as wrong. He perceived it as incomplete. The cousin wasn't meant to be hurt, only tested. The scream had ruined the sequence. In his mind, the game wasn't over. It was broken. The room was, later processed like a crime scene. Every corner catalogued, every note examined. What emerged wasn't just the portrait of a disturbed child, but the forensic architecture of premeditated ritualistic behavior, the placement of the toy, the creation of tools, the written plans, the symbolic reenactments. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. It was the culmination of months, maybe years, of internal rehearsal, a calculated progression from passive obsession to active execution, not because he wanted to kill, but because the fantasy demanded a participant. And when the toy could no longer fulfill that role, reality stepped in. And for a mind already fractured by emotional neglect and shaped by trauma, the line between simulation and action ceased to exist. To those who observed from a distance, the toy was just fabric and thread, a worn object stitched together with time and habit. But to him, it was never just a toy. It was memory, it was voice, it was power. It carried the silence he couldn't explain, the pain he couldn't articulate, and the rage he didn't yet know how to name. In the landscape of his fractured psychology, the toy became a vessel for emotional displacement. Every feeling he buried, every experience he couldn't decode, was channeled into that object. And in doing so, he gave it life, not in the magical sense, but in the psychological one. The toy represented control in a world where he had none. When the household was unstable, when his cries went unanswered, the toy listened. It was always there, predictable, present. And in the development of deviant behavior, especially in children exposed to early trauma, the formation of such symbolic anchors is not uncommon. But what makes cases like his so disturbing is the extent to which the object becomes more than emotional support. It becomes identity. It becomes logic. It becomes law. He didn't just project feelings onto the toy, he assigned it roles. Sometimes victim, sometimes accomplice, sometimes judge. And in each role, he created narratives with rules that made sense only to him. This is where fantasy blends with moral distortion, a key indicator in early psychopathy and dissociative identity formation. He wasn't just acting through the toy. He was deflecting responsibility, separating the violent thoughts from the self by attaching them to a proxy. The toy could hold the thoughts he wasn't allowed to express. It could do what he couldn't, say what he feared, and eventually test what he imagined. From a psychological perspective, the toy was a coping mechanism turned cognitive architecture. It held the rituals, the language, and the emotional resonance of every moment he lived in solitude. The circle around it wasn't just symbolic protection, it was psychological containment. He needed it to exist because without it, he had no way to make sense of the world or of himself. Removing it would have been like deleting the only map he had. And once that map failed, he reached for the only logical next step: interaction with the real. The crime wasn't born out of impulse. It was the direct extension of a belief system he had built, piece by piece, through years of internal rehearsal. And at the center of that belief system was the toy. Not as a friend, not even as an object of love, but as a filter, a judge, a moral compass distorted by trauma, isolation, and silence. In this child's mind, the toy was not just justification, it was truth. And that truth demanded proof, and proof required action. If you've stayed with me through this story, then you're not here for surface-level horror. You're someone who understands the depth of the human mind, the invisible scars of childhood, and the terrifying quiet from which violence can emerge. You're someone who listens between the lines. And for that, this channel was made for you. So if this story moved you, if it made you reflect, or if it left you with a chill you can't quite name, I ask you, now, subscribe to the channel. Here we explore the intersections between crime, psychology, childhood, and silence. Stories that disturb not because they're loud, but because they're quiet and real. If you made it to the end, let me know in the comments. Tell me this, did you feel a sign? Did you hear a silence that reminded you of someone? Comment below. I saw the shadow behind the toy. And of course, if this content brought you value, leave your like. It helps levar essas histórias para quem precisa entender que nem sempre o perigo grita. Às vezes, ele sussurra. Now, don't stop here. The next story is already waiting for you. Click the video appearing on your screen and dive deeper into the psychology of a child who never blinked, even when everyone else turned away. I'll see you there.